Hi everyone, it's Margaret Manning here with lifeafterdeath.com. Lifeafterdeath.com is a community of people who have an interest in the topic of life after death, reincarnation, the afterlife, and the spiritual issues that relate to that. We ask questions, we talk to experts on this topic, and try to keep a fair and open conversation on this conversation. Now, my guest today is Philip Almond. Philip is a retired professor of the history of religious thought at the University of Queensland in Australia. He has had a passion for the study of religion for many years, and he says he is not really a religious person, but more a seeker, trying to understand how the thought about religion and life after death fits into our worldview. So, Philip, I would love to welcome you to the show today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Margaret.
Okay, and I want to mention too that you have written several books. You're an author of books with the most provocative titles. You've written one called A History of Life After Death. You've written The Devil, A New Biography, and you've just completed one called God, A New Biography. So we'll talk about the books later because those are most fascinating. But tell me about your passion for religion. What started it? Where did you get going with this?
Well, I started when I was about 17 for reasons that aren't all that clear to me in retrospect. But I didn't want to go to university and do science. That sounded too hard. I didn't want to go to work. That sounded too hard. So I thought I'll find a place to explore, write some poetry and think about the meaning of life. So I ended up in a Church of England Episcopalian monastery. And there I stayed for 5 years, training for Anglican priesthood. But although I finished, I left the bishop at the altar. I was never ordained a priest.
Wow, so that's a pretty early, that's an early start to your curiosity about religion and how it fits. But what I'm most fascinated by, and we'd like to chat about in this conversation, is the history of our thinking about life after death. I mean, it goes obviously way, way back, and you studied it from the distant past to the present. Can you just give us a brief overview of kind of how our thoughts have changed about life after death?
Well, I suppose if we look to the early Greek texts and the biblical writings in the Old Testament, we find there that there's a belief generally that life continues after death, and it continues in some really shady realm where we're sort of there, but we're not quite there. In Greek, it's in Hades. In the Old Testament, we live on in Sheol. So, and everyone goes to the same place regardless. So we live a kind of ghostly existence in this gloomy, dark place. By the time that the New Testament period comes into play, that is to say the beginning of the Common Era, we've got something different going on. Mm-hmm. We've now two places to which the dead go. On the one hand, they go to what was Hades or Sheol, and on the other hand, they'll go to paradise or the bosom of Abraham. And the crucial thing that's happened is why they go to one place rather than the other. Mm-hmm. Life has become ethical, and we go to one place rather than the other as a consequence of our good or bad deeds in this life. So heaven becomes, or Abraham's bosom, paradise becomes a place of reward, and Hades, Sheol, becomes a place of punishment.
Okay, so that's fascinating. So you started though with the Greek and Roman. When I think back to thinking about life after death, I go back to the Egyptians too, because they buried their people in places where they expected them to have a necessity for their personal items, and they expected them to live on.
Yes, ironically, the Egyptian notion of the afterlife is rather like our very modern secular notion of the afterlife. Mm-hmm. That is to say, to all intents and purposes, it'll be pretty much like this one, and we'll need the same sorts of things as we have on this side of the grave. So that Egyptian tradition suddenly comes into the 19th and 20th centuries. Yeah. But before that happens, there's a whole, the Egyptian tradition basically disappears from the Greco-Roman tradition.
Yes.
And we come out of that New Testament Greek tradition.
Okay, so you've raised, I mean, you've opened a Pandora's box now to questions, because in this evolution that you've talked about, we get to the point with the Christian New Testament that we've got a heaven and hell. But what is it that lives on in these traditions? Is it some kind of a soul? Is that how it's referred to in all that you've described? And what happens to it, and what happens to the body in those?
Well, yes. As anything with the afterlife, it gets really messy. Because at the time of the New Testament, we really haven't got a strong belief any longer in life immediately after death. And the focus in that New Testament period is what happens to us when the end of the world comes.
Right.
And the New Testament tradition is primarily about what happens to us when the end of the world comes. And the dominant belief there is that our bodies will be resurrected and then we'll continue on in some kind of post-mortem existence in the body, as it were. On the other hand, there's that notion already in the New Testament that we will sort of maybe continue after death, but then we'll continue in a spiritual rather than a physical body. So we've got that tradition in the New Testament. About 200 years later, by about AD 200, the Greek notion of the soul is coming into the Christian tradition. And so then Christianity starts to move towards a kind of body-soul dualism, so that after death, the soul will continue on, but at the time of the end of the world, the body will be resurrected, it will be reunited with its soul, and then on we go from there in heaven or hell.
So in that tradition, is there a cosmic soul that everything comes from and returns to, or is it different? I mean, I'm thinking more now of the Eastern traditions, but in the Western that you just described, where does that soul come from?
Look, in the Western tradition, it's generally thought to come out of any of three places. The first place that it comes out of is it's created by God. The soul is created by God for every individual at the moment of conception.
Okay.
The second view is that God doesn't have to intervene in the creation of the soul, but the soul is created in much the same way as the body is, so that the soul is transmitted with the male semen into the female, and then the soul then is there from the beginning. God doesn't have to do anything.
Okay. He kind of built that into the anatomy of the human being.
Yeah, exactly. It just flows on happily. The third tradition, a minor tradition in Western thought, is the notion of the pre-existence of the soul. And that's the notion that when God created everything at that time, at the creation of the world, he created all souls ready to come into bodies at the appropriate time. So the Western tradition generally has ignored the doctrine of the pre-existence of the soul to all intents and purposes. It's seesawed between what's called traducianism, and that's the doctrine that the soul is created along with the body, as against the doctrine of immediate creationism, which is that God creates the soul at the moment of conception. That's why, of course, there's such a concern about issues around abortion within the Christian tradition.
Yes.
Because already a being with a soul at the moment of conception or pretty soon afterwards.
So, Philip, what fuels these subtle changes in the way that we perceive and have the conversation about life after death? Is it cultural, economic? I mean, what happens? Like, for example, you mentioned the ethical element came into being, later on. What fuels that, you think?
In terms of the notion of reward and punishment after life is predominantly fueled by a sense of justice. That is to say, it's obvious to all of us on this side of the grave that bad things happen to good people, that it's often the wicked that are rewarded and the good seem to get good.
Yeah.
It's not fair. It's just not fair.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the ethical afterlife was created to alter that balance, to say, well, not to worry. At the end of the day, the good will receive their reward and the wicked will receive their punishment. Mm-hmm. So that ethical afterlife. As to why people started to believe in an afterlife at all, it's in the most general sense, it's really tricky to sort out. We don't think we've got any strong evidence one way or another. I suppose at the moment it goes down to the individual psychology, or the psychology of what it is to be human rather than not to be human. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We know that what separates us off from other species is that we have a conscious sense of self. And there is a sense, I think, in which people come to believe that just can't wither away, that just can't fizzle like a candle being blown at the point of death. Somehow that will continue.
Yeah, you can't conceive of non-existence somehow in while you're in this physical body.
No, that's right. We just feel that this has something permanent about it.
Yeah. So we talked a bit about the Western traditions, but what about those traditions where there's a different perspective on reincarnation, for example, in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, where you've got this sense that you get a second chance, or in fact that the whole process of life is one lifetime after another?
Yes, I mean, we need to nuance Hinduism a little bit differently, I guess, from Buddhism,
Yeah,
because Hinduism has a doctrine of the soul and Buddhism doesn't. But putting that to one side for a moment, the irony is, I think, in Hinduism and Buddhism, that the never-ending cycle of birth and death and rebirth, to which we're all bound for eternity, is the great horror from which we want to escape. So the Eastern traditions generally have sets of practices which are directed towards eventually escaping from this dreadful cycle of birth and death and rebirth. That's the cause of suffering. Everything is suffering, as the Buddha would, for the simple reason that we can't escape from this. So the ideal is to escape from this cycle of rebirth into something more permanent in the Hindu tradition, and ironically, something less permanent in the Buddhist tradition.
Yeah, it's really interesting though, because I always like, your research has been on the history of religious thought, like how religious thought has evolved over time. And I think about India, for example, and in a country where you've got billions of people as opposed to millions of people, it's almost like you have to have some kind of a religious structure that gives more, permanence somehow. Like you just have culturally, there's a cultural driver around the history of life after death, or the thinking of life after death. Do you agree with that? Or how do you explain one very distinct thing developing in the East and another in the West?
Well, it's really, I mean, in the case of both the West and East, in both cases, afterlife is also driven predominantly by ethical considerations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so true. Just as what happens in the afterlife...
It's karma. Yeah, karma.
Exactly. So that the doctrine of rebirth is intimately related to the ethical considerations around good and evil in case of karma. And we know there that in the Christian tradition, our karmic inheritance comes to an end when God makes a judgment. But in the Indian tradition, the karma, just good and bad, just carries on. And it's karma, particularly evil karma, that continues to bind us to this infinite cycle of samsara. So again, whether Western or Eastern, it's in a sense that justice drives both of those traditions in their fundamental understandings of the afterlife.
Mm-hmm. Now, this has really pulled together some thinking that's not confused me, but I've questioned for a long time. But I wanted to close our conversation on this topic by asking about science, because science is now emerging as, it's technology, and we're now being able to weigh this magical spirit as it leaves the body at death. And, we're doing things with life after death conversations with a scientific view. What do you think the future of that is?
Look, I'd have to say I'm a bit sceptical about it all. I mean, there's now been, to all intents and purposes, around about, we can say, 130 years of scientific investigation into the afterlife. And it began in the middle of the 19th century when spiritualism came into vogue, and any number of late 19th century and early 20th century scientists tried to do the sort of scientific investigations that would prove the existence of life beyond the grave. And generally speaking, it didn't quite work out as people might have hoped. The evidence just didn't stack up, not least because many of the mediums were exposed as complete frauds. But aside from that, you just couldn't manage the experimental data to come up with firm conclusions scientifically about the existence of life after death. The other problem with science and the afterlife was that from the middle of the 19th century, science generally started to be driven by a kind of underlying philosophy of materialism. Consequence of that was that by definition, souls couldn't exist. By definition, souls were nothing but brains, and therefore, when the brain died, consciousness and life ended. those who were genuinely interested in trying scientifically to explore the afterlife couldn't get very far, and those who adopted a materialistic understanding of the world and denied the spiritual nature of existence ruled it out from the start.
So I'm gathering that in your book, A History of Life After Death, you cover all this in much more detail. And if people want to, learn more, they can go and check that out. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, that would be good.
That would be a good place to go. The reason I mentioned science is so interesting. I interviewed Dr. Raymond Moody a little while ago, which I'm sure Dr. Moody was the near-death experience man.
Yes.
And it was interesting because we talked about the hundreds of stories that people have given of what they experienced when they quote died, and at the end of it all, he actually came back to a very similar conversation that you're having, which is, we need another language to talk about this, because the soul that as we define it is not, we can't compare apples and oranges here.
Yes. And I think it's interesting in some ways in the modern world, even those who are interested in an afterlife, they're not really basing it too strongly on a kind of Platonic Greek doctrine of the soul. People are more interested in talking about the continuation of the spirit rather than the soul. And the spirit itself in the afterlife now seems to have a kind of bodily edge to it. So it's not so much our souls continue, but really will continue to exist in some kind of spiritual body. So that seems to me a more modern understanding of what the afterlife might be like. Not a material body, but a kind of spiritual, sort of ethereal body.
So what do you think happens when we die?
Look, I've got no idea. Look, I'm hoping to be pleasantly, but not unpleasantly surprised. That's about as far as I'm willing to go.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us. This has been a really exciting, interesting conversation. And we're going to be talking about some other topics, but I want to just thank you for the work that you put into doing all this research and making it available for us all. So I do appreciate it. Thank you so much, Philip.
Thank you, Margaret.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our Life After Death YouTube channel and visit our website at lifeafterdeath.com. We are a community of people who are fascinated by the topic of life after death and subjects like near-death experience, the afterlife, reincarnation, and spirituality. Together, we are exploring and discovering these topics together with curiosity and an open heart.